Within the poetic vision of Blake, devils, angels all appeared. And somehow he had this weird kind of idea that what the church teaches us as the definition of God is definitely very, very satanic. And this strange kind of idea about divinity is what makes people think that Blake is a madman. There's a very thin line between lunacy and what we call poetic genius. A very fine distinction between madness and intensity of thought, sublimity of mind. Standing on the fringes of this border, we have a person who has baffled critics over generations. Is he a versifier of simple nursery rhymes, or is he a grim philosopher who is so hard to understand? We are going to have a couple of classes on such a mad genius, William Blake, and today is the first session. In today's class, we are going to look at William Blake's life, the way he began and prospered as a writer, as a painter, and eventually how his thoughts, his ideas were first ridiculed and then celebrated in the world. Welcome to NibblePop, and I'm sure you have subscribed by now. This is Monami Mukherjee. Stay with me till the end. It is customary for history of English literature books to state that the British Romantic movement started with the publication of lyrical ballads. That was 1798. Some people also go on to say that the French Revolution happens to be the starting point, that kind of triggers the whole movement towards its culmination. If you look at the curriculum design across universities, you will see that poetry of Romantic period, they all begin from Wordsworth, Coleridge, and go up to Byron. On a personal level, I believe that the seeds were sowed quite some time before the French Revolution even. One man cannot bring about a movement. Yes, it needs a lot of people. And maybe that's why William Blake will never be considered the harbinger of Romanticism in the way Wordsworth and Coleridge are considered. But he was the person who chose to be a romantic when Romanticism was not even defined in the country. This is because William Blake decided to defy all definitions, starting from the definition of God. In the year 1757, it was November 28 when William Blake was born. He was born in City, and his parents were not conventional church-going people in a way. They were very religious, yes, but there was a rift between the church which England followed and the religion which his parents chose to follow. Now, although Blake went to a traditional school in the very beginning of his life, by the time he was 10, he was taken out of school and put under the tutelage of his mother. So it was his mother who taught him to read and write. Now, why did that happen? Why did his parents do that? Blake's father was a pretty well-to-do person, a businessman. He had a shop in London. But he saw something in his boy which made him feel that if I put my son to a conventional school, then he would be severely injured, and not physically, mentally. Blake was a person who, from his very childhood, he was kind of a visionary. He could actually see faces of God and angels, and not just in his dreams when he was wide awake. His imagination was so fine-tuned that his parents understood that a traditional school would rob him by their rote learning of the Bible, their imposition of mindless rules, and they didn't want that for their son. As he was growing up, still young, in his teenage, Blake started to go to an engraver and become a trainee. So who was an engraver? Now, back in those days, printing was not that sophisticated a form or a mechanism, and therefore, whenever illustrations, paintings, they were to be produced in bulk, then engravings were to be made so that one could print a lot of copies of a certain illustration. Now, when you are typing any document, then it is an easy thing to do. Anybody can do that. But when you are going to illustrate something, make a painting, suppose you want to recreate Michelangelo's art or Da Vinci's paintings, that's going to be a very difficult thing. Not everybody can do that. So it requires special skill, and Blake started to develop his skills, and he was very good at this. And as he was growing up as an apprentice, he eventually started to understand that there was a painter in him, there was a poet in him, an original one, and he was not just destined to copy others' works. So his training period also was kind of a revelation period for him, when he realized that he had a lot to tell the world. His first publication was Poetical Sketches, and by the age of 21, he got admitted to a very prestigious institution. It was the Royal Academy of Arts, and back then the director was Joshua Reynolds, very famous. But Joshua Reynolds followed a certain kind of technique when it came to painting, which was not in tune with what William Blake wanted to express himself through. So there was a kind of rebelliousness in him. He wanted to break away from the things that were being taught to him in that academy itself. He loved Michelangelo and Raphael. One of the reasons could be that when he was growing up, his education was mostly at home, and he concentrated on the texts which were scriptural in nature, Bible and related gospels and stuff. And therefore, he was given books where there were probably these kinds of illustrations which had an impact on his mind. And as I was telling you, he was a visionary with a great imagination. He could somehow connect to the grandeur that the pictures painted by Michelangelo and Raphael that represent. Soon he was in love with a woman who could not read and write. Her name was Catherine. They got married, and interestingly, he taught her to read and write. And not just that, she became a partner in his work. What kind of work did he pursue? What kind of career did he go for? Of course, the career of an engraver. He became a qualified engraver in 1778, then he got married, and in 1784 he opened a print shop with a partner, a friend. Now in that print shop, they mostly printed political pamphlets. Now if you concentrate on the year, you would see that this was the year, just a few years before the French Revolution. So a lot of rebellious thoughts were going around, and people had this need to print pamphlets, and Blake's shop was all open for these rebellious spirits. Now during this period, he also came across numerous luminaries, great philosophical people, political thinkers, feminist thinkers during his time, and that had a lot of impact on his mind. Now, as an engraver, he continued experimenting till he discovered a very unique process, the process of relief etching. Now, in this process, which is kind of a reverse engraving technique, you use a copper plate with the foreground, which is not dissolvable in acid, and the background, which is dissolved in acid. So this is kind of a technique which he developed, and he eventually printed his first book by this technique, the book which became so famous, Songs of Innocence. This was printed in 1789. And why is that year so important? Because that is the year of the French Revolution. Interesting, isn't it? After Songs of Innocence, there was a lot of changes in the way he thought about things, and maybe he had certain ideas in his mind which needed to be put down as a contrary to what he was writing in the Songs of Innocence. And then came Songs of Experience a few years later. Now, usually when a poet writes a set of poems, this is a literary experience. You read those poems. Okay, like Lyrical Ballads was published by Wordsworth, which had some poems, we could read them. But this was different. Here, we couldn't just read them, we could see them, we could visualize them, because all around the pages and the scribblings, we had these unique illustrations, sometimes very, very intense, and sometimes carefree, breezy, beautiful. This was a unique thing that was happening, because until now, we had poets and we had painters. Now, we have a person who was both a poet and a painter, and yet whose paintings and poetry were too much for the society to accept at the moment. So he got fame neither as a painter nor as a poet. He got branded as a lunatic. And not just by anyone, Wordsworth himself. He openly writes this, and I'm just quoting from Wordsworth here for you. There was no doubt that this poor man was mad, but there is something in the madness of this man which interests me more than the sanity of Lord Byron and Walter Scott. William Wordsworth, a sane man, he thinks that William Blake is a mad person. But why? Why is he considered to be mad at all? Back then, religion was considered to be the fabric which kind of shrouded humanity, civilization. And religion was something that was severely controlled by the church, the authorities. Blake was an extremely religious person, but Blake was totally against any kind of authority. He was, you can say, a greater Puritan than Milton. He believed that if my heart was pure, if my allegiance is true, then why should I need an intermediary to reach God? Why should I need a priest to reach God? So the practitioners of priesthood, this whole system of church, this idea of the scriptures being the law books warning you against sin, this whole idea was something which Blake hated so much. Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience are considered to be sister books, twin books. They complement each other. So what did he write in them? In Songs of Innocence, he wrote simple poems about happy children, sweet animals, idyllic landscape with no fear of judgment, no fear of any kind of attack, no fear of death. and no concept of fall. So it's like a pre-fallen state of guiltless union with God. And in Songs of Experience, he wrote a different set of poems, often with even same kind of or parallel titles, where he focuses on the way in which experience takes us away from innocence. What is innocence? On one hand, innocence means being free of guilt, to be good in God's eyes because we haven't committed any sin. But from a different perspective, it also means ignorance, naivety, and a certain kind of weakness. Because innocence or inexperience is a liability when the world is not a pre-fallen one. So experience is seen not just an act of transgression. It's not like Eve experienced the forbidden fruit and therefore experience is branded as sin. It's not. Blake doesn't use the word songs of sin. Usually the word opposite in meaning to innocence is sin or sinfulness. It is experience only when you see it through Blake's perspective. Within the poetic vision of Blake, devils, angels all appeared. And somehow he had this weird kind of idea that what the church teaches us as the definition of God is definitely very, very satanic. Because God cannot be that judgmental. And this strange kind of idea about divinity is what makes people think that Blake is a madman. I'm going to quickly take you through some of the words he actually said in Marriage of Heaven and Hell. That's a book which he wrote. This was kind of a combination of poetry and prose. Again, it's like he never bothered about these generic confinements, like if I'm writing a poem, I should write a poem. No, he thought that if I'm writing, I'm just writing and I'm also painting. So it's always a kind of a spontaneous overflow for him. In Marriage of Heaven and Hell, he writes, the ancient poets animated all sensible objects with gods or geniuses, calling them by the names and adorning them with properties of woods, rivers, mountains, lakes, cities, nations, and whatever their enlarged and numerous senses could perceive. So this means that he's talking about the origin of the idea of God. So since he's talking about God and gods here, he's not just talking about the Christian God, but idea of gods in civilized societies. And particularly, they studied the genius of each city and country, placing it under its mental deity. If you are familiar with Greek city-states, you would know that the cities were considered to be under the rule or governance of one particular deity. Till a system was formed which some took advantage of. Now, this system is the system of Christian religion, where you don't have gods anymore, we have single God. Till a system was formed which some took advantage of and enslaved the vulgar by attempting to realize or abstract the mental deities from their objects. So he's talking directly about the way nature worship was a part of human beings' idea of divinity, paganism, natural objects, mental thoughts, all these things were considered to be sacred and worshipped as deities. We have seen this in Greek culture, we have seen this in ancient Hindu culture. But with the advent of monotheism, religions where there's only one God, what's happening is these previously deified objects such as the sun, such as the planets, this ocean, which were considered to be deities or gods, they are robbed of their divinities. And what's happening then? Till a system was formed which some took advantage of. Who took advantage of? The priests, of course, who were practitioners of this kind of scriptural religion, and enslaved the vulgar. That means the original pagan believers. They were enslaved by attempting to realize or abstract the mental deities from their objects. Now, the God in monotheistic religion, he or she, it's never a she, it's always a he is never associated with any object. He's like everywhere. Thus began priesthood. And then he goes on to say a very interesting thing. And at length they pronounced that the gods had ordered such things. Thus men forgot that all deities reside in the human breast. So this is a man who prioritizes human heart. Now that makes me think about the lines from Paradise Lost. Milton said in Paradise Lost when he was invoking the heavenly muse, "O spirit, if thou prefer before all temples the upright heart and pure." This is what Blake is talking about here. Coming to something other than this, which I want you to listen to, is a remarkable thing that he wrote. To see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. What is the most confusing thing for human beings? The perception of time. This is one thing we can never ever perceive. We can see daylight, we can see the night, we can touch, feel, sense, all tangible things, but we cannot even experience time with any of our senses. But we know that this is the only certainty that we have on earth. So this baffles us as much as divinity baffles us. And to hold eternity in your hand means you're having full control of your confusion. And at the same time, you know that it doesn't matter what eternity is, so long as you have it held in your palm. It doesn't matter what happens after you stop existing. So that is a very, very intense romantic way of looking at things like permanence, transience, things which baffled poets like John Keats, who wrote years after Blake. And this idea of, heaven in a wild flower, this shows that Blake was always against any kind of scripture, any kind of law book, which takes man away from nature. He saw Christ in nature. He saw Christ as the Lamb of God. And that is why he wrote in the Everlasting Gospel in 1818, "The vision of Christ that thou dost see is my vision's greatest enemy. Both read the Bible day and night, but thou readest black where I read white." Thou means everybody who follow those scriptures blindly. The whole set of priests and followers of church religion. And Blake is against them because he feels that the scriptures are taking him away from his real visions, the visions which he had when he was a child. And so he says that thou readest black where I read white. His thoughts, his ideas are pristine, pure. Somehow, it is important to have some working knowledge about Blake's idea of divinity before going into any poem that he wrote, especially poems which belong to songs of innocence and experience. And it is also advisable for you to Not just read the 2 poems prescribed in your syllabus. Often you just have tiger and lamb prescribed together. If possible, just get a hold of those 2 beautiful books. They must be there in your college libraries. I'm definitely sure about that. You have this access to these infinite number of PDFs now that you are so very smart with online learning. Why I'm telling this is, try to read books where you can see the illustrations, because otherwise you will have only half of what he wants to communicate. When we will be covering the 2 poems, Lamb and the Tiger, in our next video, I'll try to show you the illustrated text and try to work with you to understand how that illustration, how that painting alongside the text, how that makes the poem more intense and communicate more than just the words on the page. Under the guise of these small little sweet poems which he wrote, especially in Songs of Innocence, Blake actually reflected on the social ills that he was seeing around him. He was rebelling against things like child labor, slavery, social inequities, the difference between rich and poor. He does that with such a flair, such a skill of flow, you can say, that you hardly realize when he is instructing you and when is he questioning you. Or maybe Blake loves to instruct through questioning, through interrogation, as if under the guise of asking questions, he is making us feel the need to ask questions. Because every rebellion, every revolution begins with questions. Why us? Why me? How can we change? He went on printing with his technique where he was going on dissolving copper in acid. The fumes were so poisonous, toxic, that he started to develop symptoms very similar to liver cirrhosis. His health broke down, and by 1827, he was gone. He was buried where non-conformist people are buried, which means people who do not believe in regular church religion. But you know the greatest irony of all? In his poem, or rather epic poem, Milton, Blake he began the epic poem with a verse called Jerusalem. Jerusalem is an idea about this heaven on earth, this concept that this city is that promised land where everything will be good. And this whole verse gives this idea that Christ comes to England, and there is this promise that it will turn into Jerusalem. But there are some bad things happening which has to be overcome. Now, this verse, Jerusalem, it contained words like dark satanic mills, directly referring to the industrial revolution in England, which kind of took men away from the happy valleys of nature and was a polluting thing. It led to massive problems, both economic and emotional. That Jerusalem lyric, written by this non-conformist madman, that Jerusalem lyric is now sung as almost the national hymn of England in the churches of England. England is a strange country, isn't it? We will see how his idea of God, his idea of creation, his idea of divinity is reflected in one of the most quoted, most characteristic poems of Songs of Innocence, that is the Lamb. And we will see how he creates a parallel universe, almost like a metaverse or multiverse, I would say, where we see the other end of the spectrum, the tiger. Are they opposites? Are they parallel? We are going to look into all that very soon in our next video. Till then, read up all you can on the background of William Blake and ask me as many questions as you want before we take up those two poems. Also, let me know in the comment section if you have any other poems prescribed in your syllabus from Songs of Innocence and Experience. Maybe we can just refer to those poems after we finish talking about the lamb and the tiger, if time permits, and then we can have a well-rounded discussion too. So thank you for being with us. See you all in my next video. This is Monami Mukherjee signing off. Stay happy, stay safe. Bye-bye.